The scream was born in fire and died in her throat. One moment, her mother's laughter was a melody weaving through the scent of pine and hearth smoke. The next, the world was the splintering of wood and the cold, flat glint of an axe in the moonlight. The sound that should have torn from Freydis's 6-year-old lungs, a sound of pure, world-ending terror caught behind her teeth. It coiled in her chest, a serpent of ice and ash, and there it stayed. For 10 years it has remained, a suffocating presence. She can still feel its weight, a phantom pressure against her ribs, a constant reminder of the night the silence took hold and refused to let go. Now she is a ghost in her father's great hall. Jarl Bjorn Iron-Heart, a man whose voice can make seasoned warriors flinch, presides over his domain with the force of a winter storm. Mead flows, boasts are shouted, and songs of glory echo off the high-beamed ceiling. Freydis sits near the fire, a still point in the swirling chaos of life. She watches, she listens, she feels the vibrations of the noise through the wooden bench. Men look at her, their gazes a mixture of pity and unease. She is the Jarl's daughter, a prize and a curse, the living embodiment of a silence that even her formidable father cannot conquer. His frustration is a palpable thing, another shadow in the hall. The Jarl's heavy tankard slams down on the oak table, the sound cracking through the din like a whip. The hall falls quiet. Every eye turns first to him, then to her. Bjorn's gaze pins her in place. It isn't filled with rage, not this time, but with a deep, aching weariness that is somehow worse. He has brought healers who chanted over her, with smoking herbs and seers who read runes in her name. All have failed. He can break armies and bend chieftains to his will, but he cannot coax a single sound from his own child. In her impenetrable quiet, he sees not his daughter's pain, but the stark, undeniable limit of his own power. Their world is carved from stone and ice, a land of jagged fjords that claw at a perpetually gray sky. The wind that sweeps down from the northern glaciers is a relentless, living thing, whispering tales of hardship and survival. It shapes the trees, bending them into gnarled figures of submission, and it shapes the people, carving lines of resilience into their faces. For Freydis, this harsh landscape is a comfort. Its stark, unyielding nature feels honest. It doesn't pretend to be warm or gentle. It simply is, in all its brutal majesty. She often feels more kinship with the frozen mountains than with the boisterous people in her father's hall, for they, too, know the language of a deep and profound silence. The great hall is the beating heart of their settlement, a place of warmth against the oppressive cold. The central fire pit spits and crackles, its light catching on the polished horns of drinking cups and the intricate carvings of sea serpents on the support beams. The air is thick with the smells of roasting meat, spilled ale, and damp wool. To everyone else, this is a sanctuary of community and strength. To Freydis, it is a theater of alienation. She is an audience member watching a play in a language she knows but cannot speak. Every laugh, every shouted order, every whispered secret is a reminder of the invisible wall that separates her from her own people. While her voice is a prisoner, her mind is a wanderer. Her silence has honed her other senses to a razor's edge. She can read the subtle politics of the hall in a single glance, the way a warrior's hand rests possessively on the hilt of his sword when a rival speaks, the flicker of fear in a servant's eyes, the false heartiness in a visiting trader's laugh. She collects these unspoken truths, these tiny fragments of human drama. Her mind is a library of observations, a storm of thoughts and feelings that has no outlet. She is more aware, more perceptive than any of them, yet they see her as a simpleton, a broken doll. Sometimes, the memories that surface are not of the fire, but of the time before. She remembers the weight of her mother's hand on her hair, the soft, rhythmic thump of the loom as she wove intricate patterns into cloth. Her mother would hum, a low, gentle sound that was the bedrock of Freydis's world. She can almost smell the wild herbs her mother used to scent their sleeping furs, a fragrance of summer and safety. These memories are a double-edged sword. They are a warm sanctuary she can retreat to, but they also sharpen the edges of her loss, making the present silence feel even colder and more absolute by comparison. She studies her father, Jarl Bjorn. He is a man forged by battle, his face a map of old scars and his hands thick with calluses from gripping an axe. His people see him as an unshakable pillar of strength, their Iron-Heart. Freydis sees the cracks in the iron. She sees the way his shoulders slump when he thinks no one is watching, the tormented look in his eyes when he gazes into the fire late at night. His love for her is a clumsy, violent thing, tangled up in his pride. He wants to fix her the way he would fix a splintered shield or a dull blade, with force and will, and he cannot comprehend why she resists his efforts. The last healer was a stooped old man with milky eyes who claimed to speak with the spirits. He'd burned a foul-smelling root and chanted in a rattling voice, his hands hovering inches from Freydis' face. She had stood perfectly still, enduring the ritual, as she had endured all the others. It wasn't the man she feared, but the collective hope of the onlookers, a heavy expectation pressing in on her. They wanted a miracle, a spectacle. The attempt only fortified the walls of her silence, making her retreat further into the one place no one could reach. Her quiet became her armor, her only defense against their relentless prying. Tonight, after the last of the warriors have stumbled off to their beds, Bjorn approaches her. The great hall is cavernous and still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. He kneels before her, a giant brought low, his knees cracking in the quiet. "Freydis," he says, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Just one word. Say my name, please." He reaches for her hand, but a flash of memory, of a different hand, holding a gleaming axe, explodes behind her eyes. She flinches back, a sharp, silent gasp her only reply. A look of utter desolation washes over his face, quickly replaced by a familiar, simmering darkness. He rises without another word, the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor echoing his retreat. Freydis remains by the dying fire, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the unyielding cage of her ribs. The fear subsides, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache of loneliness. She knows he loves her, but his love feels like a heavy cloak trying to smother her. He wants her to speak for his sake, to ease his own pain and failure. He doesn't understand that the scream she holds inside isn't just a memory. It's a living part of her now, and to let it out might shatter what little is left. She slips out a side door into the frigid night air. The cold stings her cheeks, a clean, sharp sensation that helps to clear the suffocating atmosphere of the hall. She makes her way along a well-worn path toward the cliffs that loom over the fjord. This is her true home, her sanctuary. Here, the only sounds are the roar of the wind and the eternal, rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. The wind doesn't ask questions or demand answers. It simply howls its own story of power and solitude, a song she understands perfectly. Here, her silence doesn't feel like a lack. It feels like a part of the natural world. From her perch high above the settlement, she watches the patterns of life unfold. She sees the flicker of lanterns as the night watch makes its rounds. She sees the smoke curling from the chimneys of the long houses where families are sleeping. Her silence has given her the gift of perspective. While others are caught in the noise and urgency of their own lives, she sees the whole tapestry. She sees the connections, the dependencies, the small kindnesses and hidden cruelties. She's the unseen chronicler of her people, her memories, the only record of these quiet, everyday moments that history will never bother to write down. The memory of the attack never fades completely. It lives just beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. A sudden shout, the clang of dropped metal, the smell of wood smoke growing too thick. Any of these can send her tumbling back into that night. She feels the rough floorboards against her cheek where she hid, sees the monstrous shadows of the raiders thrown against the wall by the light of their own burning home. The terror is not a distant echo. It is a physical sensation that can rise up and steal her breath, tightening its icy grip around her throat and reinforcing the lock on her voice. She has learned to read the language of pity. It is in the softened voices people use when they address her, as if she were a startled fawn. It is in the extra portion of honey cake a cook might press into her hand, or the way a warrior averts his gaze as she passes. They think she is fragile, empty, a spirit in a girl's body. Their kindness is a cage, defining her by her wound. They cannot imagine the fierce, complex world that exists inside her head, the arguments she has with herself, the stories she weaves from her observations, the sheer, screaming force of the life trapped within her. One afternoon, while walking in the sparse woods behind the hall, she discovers a young fox with its leg caught in a hunter's forgotten snare. A wave of pure, unthinking empathy washes over her. Kneeling in the snow, she works at the cruel wire with numb fingers. The frightened animal snaps at her, but she feels no fear. She wants to soothe it, to make a soft, shushing sound. Her lips part, her lungs fill with air, but the pathway from thought to sound is a broken bridge. A choked, powerless puff of air is all that emerges, and the bitter taste of ash floods her mouth once more. A deep, resonant blast from the watchtower horn shatters the afternoon quiet. It's the signal for a returning ship. From the cliffs, Freydis sees the familiar dragon prow of one of her father's longships, slicing through the slate-gray water. The men have been gone for months, raiding the western isles. Their return means celebration and feasting, but it also means new spoils and new captives. A knot of apprehension tightens in her stomach. The arrival of strangers always disrupts the delicate balance of the settlement, and it brings the violence of the outside world directly to their shores. The ship beaches with a grating crunch of wood on stone. The warriors leap into the shallows, their triumphant shouts echoing off the cliffs. They are laden with plunder, chests of silver, bolts of dyed cloth, and weapons taken from the defeated. And then come the thralls, a chain of men and women blinking in the pale northern light, their expressions a mixture of terror and resignation. They are herded onto the shore like livestock, shivering in their thin, foreign clothes. Freydis watches the scene from above, a familiar sense of detachment washing over her. It is the predictable, brutal cycle of her world. The line of captives is marched up the winding path toward the great hall. Their heads are bowed, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They are an anonymous mass of human misery, another testament to her father's strength. But as they pass directly below her vantage point, one of them lifts his head. He is not a warrior. His build is slight, his face smudged with dirt, but devoid of the hardened brutality she is used to seeing. His eyes, for a single, startling moment, meet hers across the distance. They are not defiant or pleading, but filled with a deep, weary sorrow. In that fleeting glance, she feels an unexpected jolt, a flicker of recognition. It's as if she is looking into a mirror. The profound sadness in his eyes, the quiet endurance held in his gaze. It is a language she knows intimately. It is the same silent ache that resides in the deepest part of her own being. For the first time in as long as she can remember, she feels a crack in the ice that encases her heart. The procession moves on, and he is gone, but the image of his eyes remains, and a strange, unsettling warmth begins to spread through her frozen core. The feasting hall roared with a triumphant energy that grated on Freydis' nerves. Warriors, flushed with victory and mead, recounted their battles, each tale growing more grandiose with every telling. Her father presided over it all, his laughter the loudest sound in the room, a booming counterpoint to the crackling fire. Freydis sat in her usual place, a silent observer on the edge of the celebration. But tonight, her focus was fractured. The noise, the boasts, the smell of roasted boar, it all faded into a dull background hum. Her mind kept returning to the fjord, to the line of weary captives, and to a pair of eyes that had held not defiance, but a sorrow so profound it felt like a shared secret. The next morning the thralls were divided and assigned their new lives of servitude. Freydis watched from a high window as the Jarl's steward pointed and shouted, sending the captives scattering to their designated tasks. Some were sent to the smokehouse, others to the mending sheds or the stables. She scanned the crowd, her heart beating with an unfamiliar, anxious rhythm. She searched for the slight build, the dirt-smudged face, the quiet endurance she had recognized. She saw him for a moment, his head bowed as he was shoved toward the back of the settlement, away from the main longhouses and the warriors' quarters. He was being sent somewhere quiet, somewhere out of sight. Jarl Bjorn was in his element for days following the return. He was a man defined by conquest, and the new wealth and labor filling his halls were a testament to his power. He would often clap a heavy hand on Freydis' shoulder, his touch meant to be affectionate, but feeling more like an assertion of ownership. He'd gesture round the bustling hall and say, "All this, for us, for our name." He saw the plunder as a cure, a distraction loud enough to maybe, finally, shatter her silence. He couldn't comprehend that the noise of his world was the very thing that reinforced the walls of her prison, making her retreat even deeper into herself. Life in the settlement settled back into its familiar, rugged rhythm. The warriors cleaned their weapons, the women tended the looms, and the new thralls were absorbed into the machinery of daily existence. Yet for Freydis, something had fundamentally shifted. The image of the captive man's gaze was a persistent echo in her quiet mind. It was a strange and unsettling obsession, a flicker of warmth in a life defined by cold. She found herself looking for him as she walked the settlement grounds, her eyes scanning the faces of the workers mending nets by the shore or hauling water from the well. The question of where he had gone, of who he was, became a silent, consuming quest. Her search was a subtle thing, a series of seemingly aimless wanderings that always led her to the peripheries of the settlement. She checked the stables, the forge, the tannery, her gaze sweeping over the laborers without lingering long enough to draw attention. It was a new kind of purpose, a decision born purely of her own volition. This wasn't about her father's demands or the pity of her people. It was a private pull, a magnetic curiosity she couldn't explain. This simple act of seeking felt like a rebellion. For the first time, she was not just passively observing her world, she was actively looking for something within it, for a reflection of the silence she knew so well. She finally found him in the Jarl's personal gardens, a small, sheltered plot of land behind the great hall, where medicinal herbs and a few stubborn vegetables were coaxed from the rocky soil. It was a place few people visited, a forgotten corner of her father's domain. He was on his knees, his back to her, carefully tending a row of frost-bitten leeks. He worked with a quiet, focused grace, his movements economical and gentle. He wasn't hacking at the earth with the brute force she was used to seeing. He was interacting with it, his hands moving with a strange and delicate reverence. She stood at the edge of the garden, hidden by the corner of the hall, simply watching. There was an artistry to his labor that captivated her. The men of her world were built to break things. Ships, shields, skulls. Their hands were instruments of force, calloused from gripping the hilts of axes and the shafts of oars. But this man's hands, though clearly worn from work, seemed to understand the language of living things. He crumbled the soil between his fingers, cleared away stones with a surgeon's care, and watered the roots of a struggling plant with a slowness that felt like a prayer. He was cultivating life in a land that was so often defined by death, and the sight resonated with a part of Freydis she thought had long since withered away. A storm of unfamiliar feelings churned within her. This man, a thrall, a piece of her father's plunder, possessed a quiet strength that was entirely alien to her. It wasn't the strength of a warrior, built on dominance and violence. It was a resilience, a patient and enduring force. He was a prisoner in a hostile land, yet he was creating a small pocket of order and life amidst the chaos. The contrast was staggering. He was as trapped as she was, bound by the will of others, yet he had found a way to make something grow. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. One morning, she made a choice. It wasn't a grand, dramatic decision, but a small, terrifying step. Instead of watching from the shadows, she walked into the garden. It was her sanctuary, a place she had always come to escape the noise of the hall, but now his presence had changed its very nature. She moved silently, her soft leather boots making little sound on the damp earth. She walked to a weathered stone bench on the far side of the garden, a place where her mother used to sit. She felt his work pause, felt the weight of his awareness on her, but she did not look at him. She simply sat down, her hands clenched in her lap. He was kneeling by a patch of thyme, his trowel resting on the ground beside him. When she entered, he had frozen for only a second before his head lifted. Their eyes met across the small garden, the space between them charged with a silent, questioning energy. The world seemed to contract, the sounds of the wind and the distant settlement fading away, until there was only the two of them. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw no fear, no pity, not even curiosity. She saw only that same deep, weary sorrow she'd seen before. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to his work. That single nod was a profound gift. It was an acknowledgement of her presence without a demand for a response. He didn't stare, he didn't approach, he didn't treat her like a broken curiosity. He simply accepted her into his quiet space. A wave of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy washed over Freydis. For the first time since the night of the fire, she felt seen without being judged. She remained on the bench, her rigid posture slowly softening as she watched him work, the frantic pounding of her heart gradually slowing to a steady, even rhythm. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was shared. This became their unspoken routine. Every day, Freydis would retreat to the garden, and Kaelin, for she had learned his name from the whispers of the kitchen staff, would be there, tending to his plants. They existed in a shared bubble of quiet, a world away from the boisterous hall. He never tried to speak to her, and she, of course, could not speak to him. Yet, a language began to form between them, woven from gesture and proximity. He would leave a sprig of lavender on the bench for her, its scent a calming presence. She, in turn, would clear small stones from the path where he walked. The garden became more than a sanctuary. It became a classroom. She watched him and learned the names of the plants in her mind. Yarrow for staunching blood, willow bark for fevers, chamomile for restless sleep. He seemed to possess an ancient knowledge, a connection to the earth that her people, with their focus on the sea and the sword, had largely forgotten. He was teaching her a new way of seeing the world, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood and nurtured. In his patient care for the struggling plants, she saw a metaphor for her own bruised and silent life. This fragile piece, however, was a dangerous secret. He was a thrall, property. She was the Jarl's daughter, a symbol of his lineage. Any association between them was a transgression, a violation of the rigid social order. She knew this. The fear of discovery was a constant, cold knot in her stomach. What would her father do if he found out? His love was possessive, his anger volcanic. The thought of his rage being directed at Kaelin, at this one person who offered her a sliver of peace, was a terror that haunted her waking moments and stalked her dreams. One afternoon, a brutish warrior named Olaf stumbled upon their quiet arrangement. He had followed her, his curiosity piqued by her daily disappearances. Leaning against the garden's low stone wall, a cruel smirk spread across his face. "So this is where the little ghost hides," he sneered, his eyes flicking between Freydis and Kaelin. "Playing in the dirt with your father's new pet?" Kaelin did not look up, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. A surge of white-hot fury, fierce and protective, roared through Freydis. She wanted to scream at Olaf, to claw at his mocking face, but the sound remained trapped, a ball of fire in her throat. The warrior's taunt, meant to wound her, had the opposite effect. It solidified her resolve. The garden was her territory. This silent companionship was hers. Olaf's intrusion was a violation, and it made her fiercely protective of the one thing she had chosen for herself. After he swaggered away, laughing, she looked at Kaelin. He finally raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. In them she saw not shame or fear, but a flicker of shared defiance. The incident hadn't broken their bond. It had tempered it, forging it into something stronger, an unspoken alliance against the harshness of the world outside the garden walls. She began to participate more directly in the garden's life. It started small. She would pull the stubborn weeds from the patch of earth nearest her bench. It was a simple, repetitive task, but it grounded her. The feeling of the cool, damp soil under her fingernails was real and tangible. It was a way of connecting, of contributing to this small world they shared. Kaelin noticed, of course. One afternoon, after watching her work for some time, he looked over and offered her the faintest hint of a smile. It was not a smile of amusement or pity, but one of quiet gratitude. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Her father noticed the change in her, though he misinterpreted its source. He saw that the hollow look in her eyes had lessened, that she spent less time brooding by the fire. "The fresh air does you good, daughter," he boomed one evening, pleased with this small improvement. "Perhaps the spirits of the land are finally healing you." He remained blissfully unaware of the thrall who worked in the garden, the true catalyst for her transformation. His ignorance was a fragile shield, protecting their secret world for now. But Freydis knew it was only a matter of time. A secret this profound could not stay buried forever in the rocky northern soil. A sudden, unseasonable cold snap was predicted by the elders, who read the signs in the flight of birds and the color of the sky. A killing frost was coming, one that would wipe out the last of the garden's bounty. A sharp, piercing panic seized Freydis. Her mind went immediately to a single, stubborn wild rose bush in the corner of the garden. It had been her mother's, transplanted from a sunny southern hill years ago. It had survived, but it had never bloomed. The thought of the frost killing it felt like a second, deeper loss. The rose was a living link to her past, and she could not bear to let it die. She fled the stuffy hall as dusk fell, the air already carrying a crystalline, biting chill. She ran to the garden, her breath pluming in front of her. She found Kaelin already there, working with a quiet urgency, covering the most vulnerable plants with scraps of burlap and old animal hides. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his focus absolute. He seemed to feel the coming frost as a personal threat, a battle to be waged, not with an axe, but with foresight and care. He looked up as she approached, his expression grim, and simply nodded, understanding immediately why she had come, what she was afraid of losing. Ignoring everything else, Freydis went straight to her mother's rosebush. Its green leaves were already starting to curl at the edges, looking fragile and defeated in the fading light. A wave of overwhelming despair washed over her. It was just a plant, a collection of stems and leaves, but it represented so much more. It was her mother's laughter, the memory of a gentle hand, the last remnant of a world before the fire and the silence. To lose it would be to lose the last tangible piece of that life. Her hands hovered over the bush, trembling, unable to touch it, as if her own cold sorrow might be enough to kill it. Kaelin came to her side, moving with a slowness that was calming. He didn't say a word, but knelt beside the beleaguered plant. He looked at her face, saw the raw grief etched there, and seemed to understand that his task was not just to save a flower, but to guard a memory. He looked from her to the rose bush, his expression softening with a profound empathy. He then did something she would never forget. He reached out, not to touch the plant, but to gently touch the soil at its base, as if to offer it his own warmth and strength against the encroaching cold. Then he began to speak, but it was not the harsh, guttural Norse of her father and his warriors. A soft, melodic language flowed from him, a sound like rustling leaves or water flowing over smooth stones. The words were completely foreign to her, but their meaning was unmistakable. It was a gentle incantation, a whispered plea. He wasn't commanding the plant to live, he was encouraging it. The sound of his voice, free from the violent associations of her own tongue, bypassed the fortress of her trauma and touched a place deep inside her that had been frozen for a decade. She stood mesmerized, listening to the strange, beautiful music of his language. He was telling the rose a story, she was certain of it. Though she couldn't grasp the words, she could feel the narrative in the rise and fall of his voice, a tale of hardship, of resilience, of a small, brave thing pushing through darkness toward the light. It was her own story, her own silent scream, translated into a language of hope. For the first time in 10 years, the suffocating pressure in her chest eased, and the phantom taste of ash in her mouth was replaced by the clean, sweet scent of cold earth and living things. He finished his quiet prayer and reached for a large piece of burlap. Together, without a word, they gently draped it over the rose bush, tucking it in around the base to shield it from the worst of the coming frost. As they worked, their hands brushed for a fleeting moment. The simple, accidental contact was like a bolt of lightning, a jolt of warmth and life that shot up her arm and straight to her heart. It was a spark of human connection, pure and unburdened by history or expectation. In that single, brief touch, she felt a crack appear in the thick ice that had encased her for so long. As they both stood up, the shared task complete, a small, involuntary sound escaped her lips. It wasn't a word, or even a cry. It was a hitch in her breath, a shuddering little gasp that carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears and a decade of silence. It was the first sound she had made in the presence of another person since she was 6 years old. It was barely audible, little more than a tremor in the frigid air, but it was real. It was a beginning. The lock on her throat, rusted shut for so long, had finally, infinitesimally begun to turn. Kaelin heard it. In the deep twilight, he turned his head slowly towards her. His face was a mask of shadows, his expression impossible to read. He didn't look shocked or startled. There was only a profound stillness about him, a deep, listening quality in his eyes. He had heard the impossible, a sound from the silent girl. He held her gaze, a silent question hanging in the freezing air between them. The first crack in the dam had appeared, and now, standing before the one person who might understand, Freydis felt a terrifying, exhilarating surge. The world waited to see what would come flooding through. The world tilted on its axis, a dizzying, terrifying shift. That single, broken gasp had been an earthquake in the landscape of her soul, cracking the permafrost that had held her for a decade. Freydis stood trembling, her hand flying to her throat, as if to physically push the sound back down, to reseal the tomb. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief, were locked on Kaelin. She had betrayed her own silence, the only constant she had known. The fear was immediate and overwhelming, a cold tide rising to drown the tiny spark that had just ignited. What had she done? What beast had she just woken? Kaelin remained perfectly still, his posture one of profound, gentle attention. He did not recoil, nor did his expression betray the shock that would have contorted any other face. Instead, his eyes softened with a sorrowful understanding, as if he knew the immense cost of that tiny sound. He recognized it not as a victory, but as the breaking of a seal, the first painful tear in a scar that had held her together for years. He offered no word of praise, no gesture of excitement, only a quiet, unwavering presence that told her she was not alone in the aftershock. His calm was an anchor in her sudden, violent storm. A small, gray-feathered bird, emboldened by their stillness, alighted on the stone wall nearby, its head cocked in curiosity. It let out a short, sharp chirp. The simple, natural sound cut through the charged silence. Kaelin's gaze shifted from Freydis to the bird, and a new thought seemed to form. He saw not just a bird, but a bridge, an offering. This was a neutral subject, a life unburdened by memory or trauma. He saw a chance to gently guide her across the chasm that had just opened at her feet, to give that first crack a purpose beyond mere accident. Slowly, as if not to startle a fawn, he lifted a single finger and pointed toward the bird. He turned his head just enough to look at her, his eyes carrying the full weight of his quiet encouragement. Then he spoke. The word was not Norse. It was a soft, flowing sound, more like a breath of wind than a command. Ian. He whispered, the sound itself seeming to have the lightness of a feather. It was a gift, not a demand. It held no echo of violence, no sharp edges of authority. It was simply a name for a living thing, offered freely. The sound of his language washed over her, clean and pure. It was the tongue of the garden, of growing things, of gentle pleas to a stubborn rose. It held no ghosts for her. She felt the muscles in her throat constrict, the familiar phantom grip of terror tightening. The taste of ash and smoke, her constant companions, rose in her mouth. Yet, beneath it, there was something else now. The memory of his voice, the feel of that first involuntary sound escaping. A war was being waged in the space of a single breath, the silence of the past fighting the possibility of a future. She took a shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs. Her lips parted. She focused on the bird, on the simple shape of it against the gray sky, and on the sound Kaelin had made. She pushed. It was like trying to move a mountain with her bare hands. A raw, scraping noise was all that came at first, a sound of rust and disuse. But she pushed again, channeling a decade of observation, of sorrow, of rage, into this one tiny point of effort. And then it came, a broken, fragile whisper, a ghost of the word he had spoken, An. The moment the sound left her lips, the world did not shatter. The past did not rise up and consume her. There was only the frigid air, the silent man before her, and the bird on the wall, which chirped once more and took flight. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, followed by another and then another. They were not tears of grief, but of a profound, earth-shattering release. The first word she had spoken in 10 years was not a scream of terror, but a whisper of life, learned from a slave in a forgotten garden. A slow, wondrous smile transformed Kaelin's face. It was not a smile of triumph, but of deep, resonant relief, as if he had been holding his breath alongside her. He reached out, not to her, but to the rosebush they had saved, and gently touched a single frost-kissed leaf. The gesture was clear. See? Life holds. We hold. He had witnessed a miracle, not of the gods, but of human will. He had seen the deepest winter of a soul finally show the first tentative sign of a thaw, and he knew he was now the guardian of that fragile spring. Their secret was now a living thing, a fragile seedling in the frozen ground of their world. Her voice was a shared trust, a language of two that existed only within the low stone walls of the garden. Every time she managed to echo one of his words, the bond between them deepened, woven from forbidden sounds and shared glances. The garden was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a conspiracy. The risk was immense, a constant shadow that lay over them. If her father discovered this, if he learned a thrall had succeeded where he had so spectacularly failed, his rage would be a thing of legend. Suddenly, the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path outside the garden shattered their quiet world. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Freydis. Kaelin's expression became a mask of neutrality in an instant. He moved away from her, kneeling and making a show of inspecting the roots of a plant. Freydis backed away toward her bench, her heart hammering against her ribs, her newfound voice swallowed once more by a familiar suffocating fear. The fragile world they had built in whispers was about to be discovered, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. The footsteps belonged to a kitchen servant, sent to fetch herbs, who paid them no mind. The boy grabbed a handful of thyme, his eyes cast downward, and scurried away without a word. The immediate danger receded, but the encounter left a chilling residue. The garden was not a separate world. It was a part of her father's domain, and they were merely a secret, hidden in plain sight. The fragility of their connection was laid bare. Any careless moment, any stray sound overheard by the wrong person, could bring everything crashing down upon them in a torrent of fire and steel. Their lessons became more urgent, more clandestine. Kaelin would teach her words while pretending to work, his voice a low murmur that blended with the rustle of leaves. Asterisk we say. Asterisk he'd say while watering a plant, and she would whisper the word back to the damp earth. Asterisk cran. Asterisk he'd murmur while pruning a low-hanging branch, and she would breathe the sound to the ancient wood. Each word was a small, defiant spark against the oppressive darkness. It was a painstaking process of rebuilding, of laying one small, precious stone of sound upon another to construct a bridge back to the world. Some days were harder than others. Her throat would close up, the phantom scream reasserting its dominance, and only silence would emerge. The frustration was a physical pain, a bitter reminder of how broken she was. On those days, Kaelin would not push. He would simply hand her a freshly picked sprig of mint or chamomile, the scent a calming balm. His patience was a language in itself, a silent promise that he would wait for her, whether it took a day or another 10 years. This quiet, unwavering acceptance was the very thing that gave her the strength to try again the next day. She began to practice on her own, a fugitive speaker in her own land. She would walk the high cliffs overlooking the fjord and whisper her new vocabulary to the wind. Asterisk, in, wishe, cran. The words felt alien on her tongue, the shapes they made in her mouth unfamiliar and strange. It felt like learning to walk again after a decade of being bedridden. Her voice was thin and reedy, easily stolen by the wind, but it was hers. For the first time, she was not just an observer of the world, she was beginning to name it, to claim a small piece of it for herself. The changes in her did not go unnoticed. A flicker of light had returned to her eyes, a softening around her mouth where a perpetual line of tension had once been. The servants whispered that the spirits of the land were finally taking pity on her. Her father, Jarl Bjorn, saw it too. He was gruffly pleased, clapping her on the shoulder with his heavy hand. The quiet life suits you, daughter. It seems the gods have decided to be kind. His complete ignorance of the true cause was a blessing and a curse, a fragile shield that protected her secret while reminding her of the chasm of misunderstanding that still separated them. But not all eyes were so easily fooled. Olaf, the warrior whose mockery had first solidified her bond with Kaelin, watched her with a growing, venomous suspicion. He saw her frequent trips to the garden, the way she no longer seemed like a ghost, but a person with a hidden purpose. He was a man who thrived on the weaknesses of others, and he sensed a secret here, a vulnerability he could exploit. His gaze followed her like a carrion crow circling a wounded animal, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and tear the secret open for all to see. One afternoon, Kaelin was teaching her a new word. He held up his hand, palm open, and looked at her directly, a rare and startling intensity in his gaze. Asterisk Kara. Asterisk, he said, his voice soft but clear. He did not need to explain. She felt the meaning of the word in her bones, a warmth that spread through her chest. Friend. It was a concept she had only ever observed from a distance, a treasure belonging to other people. Now it was being offered to her, A simple, profound gift that held more value than all the silver in her father's chests. She tried to say it back. She opened her mouth, her heart full, but the word lodged in her throat. This was different from naming a bird or a tree. This word was about them. It was an admission, a confession. To speak it would be to give their secret a name, to make it real and solid and infinitely more dangerous. The emotional weight of it was too much. The old fear, the ancient trauma, surged back with a vengeance. A choked, silent sob was her only reply, and she turned away, ashamed of her own weakness, of the prison she still could not escape. Driven by a festering curiosity, Olaf had found a new hiding place. He wedged himself between a woodpile and the thick, overgrown thorns that bordered the garden's back wall. From here he had a clear, unobstructed view. He waited, his patience born of malice. He knew something was happening in this quiet place, and he was determined to be the one to expose it. He wanted to see the look on the Jarl's face when he learned his silent daughter was consorting with a thrall, to see the broken girl finally and truly shattered by her own foolishness. He didn't have to wait long. Kaelin was trying to coax a word from her again, a simple one this time, node blath asterisk, for flower. He held up a small, purple bloom. Freydis took a deep, shuddering breath and tried. The word came out as a fragile, hoarse whisper, but it was unmistakable. Asterisk. Blath. From his hiding place, Olaf heard it. He heard the thrall's soft instruction, and the girl's whispered reply. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He had it. He had the proof. The little ghost could speak, and her secret was now his weapon. Olaf strode into the great hall with the swagger of a man who held a winning hand. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of mead. He made his way directly to the high table where Jarl Bjorn sat, a heavy silver tankard in his hand. "My Jarl," Olaf boomed, his voice cutting through the noise. "I bring you news of a miracle." Every eye turned to him. "Your daughter Freydis has found her voice." A stunned silence fell over the hall, followed by a wave of excited murmurs. Bjorn stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. "But," Olaf continued, letting the word hang in the air, savoring the moment, "it is not our tongue she speaks. It is the language of the Western thrall. The guarding slave has been teaching her in secret, like a pet." The hall went deathly quiet. The hope on Bjorn's face curdled, replaced by a dark, rising tide of fury. The implication was a mortal insult. A slave, a piece of his property, had accomplished what he, the mighty Jarl, could not. It was a humiliation of the highest order, a direct challenge to his power and his pride, played out before his entire court. The Jarl's face became a thundercloud. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. He did not speak. He simply rose from his great chair, the wood groaning in protest. With a deliberate, terrifying calm, he reached for the war axe that always leaned against his throne. The gesture was not one of habit, it was one of intent. He was not just a father anymore. He was a Jarl whose authority had been mocked. And in his world, such insults were answered not with words, but with blood. The warriors in the hall shrank back, knowing the storm that was about to break. Like a force of nature, Bjorn stormed out of the hall, his heavy boots pounding a rhythm of doom on the stone floor. Olaf and two other warriors followed in his wake, their faces alight with a grim excitement. They were a hunting party, and their prey was in the garden, oblivious. Freydis and Kaelin were sitting on the stone bench, closer than they should have been. Kaelin had just pointed out a ladybug crawling on her hand, and for the first time in her life, a small, genuine laugh was bubbling in Freydis' throat, a sound she hadn't even known she was capable of making. The garden gate crashed open, and the moment was obliterated. Bjorn stood there, silhouetted against the failing light, his massive frame filling the entrance. His face was a mask of cold, unadulterated rage. He looked past his daughter, his eyes locking onto Kaelin with a predator's intensity. He saw not a man who had helped his child, but a worm who had burrowed into the heart of his family, a thief who had stolen a moment that should have been his. "You," Bjorn growled, the single word a promise of violence, a death sentence. Before Kaelin could even rise, Bjorn was upon him. He grabbed the front of Kaelin's tunic with one massive hand, lifting him effortlessly and slamming him back against the cold, hard stone of the garden wall. The sickening thud of bone and flesh against rock echoed in the small space. Freydis watched, frozen in a paralysis she knew all too well. The world dissolved into a familiar nightmare, a powerful man, an act of brutal violence, and her own suffocating, helpless silence. The terror was a physical thing, an icy hand squeezing her lungs shut, stealing the air from her body. Bjorn drew back his other arm, the war axe held high. The last rays of the setting sun caught the polished edge, creating a flash of cold, deadly light. It was the same light, the same glint of steel from 10 years ago. The memory and the reality slammed together in Freydis's mind with the force of a physical blow. The axe, the wall, the helpless man. It was all happening again. Her father was about to become the monster from her nightmares, and she was the silent witness, trapped in the same horror that had first stolen her voice. The scream, the one she had swallowed that night of fire, the one that had lived in her chest for a decade as a coiled serpent of ice and ash, began to uncoil. It was an agonizing, tearing sensation, a living thing clawing its way up her throat. She saw the muscles in her father's arm tense for the final, killing blow. Time slowed. The world narrowed to the descending arc of the axe and the impossible choice before her. Let the silence reign and watch the only person who had ever truly seen her be destroyed, or unleash the sound that she feared would shatter her into a million pieces. Her mouth opened wide. It was not a word. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a decade of compressed agony being violently released, a shriek that tore through the fabric of the evening. It was the sound of splintering wood and dying embers, of a child's terror-given voice after 10 years of festering in the dark. It was the scream born in fire, and now it was unleashed upon the world, raw, elemental, and utterly absolute. The descending axe stopped, frozen in mid-air as if caught by an invisible hand. The sheer, physical force of the sound wave seemed to push back against it, a shield forged from pure, unadulterated pain. Every living thing in the vicinity, man, bird, and beast, fell silent, stunned by the impossible noise. Jarl Bjorn's arm trembled, the muscles locked in shock. The volcanic rage that had propelled him just moments before was extinguished, doused by the horrifying sound from his own daughter's throat. He stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the silent, ghost-like girl he knew with the creature who had just ripped a hole in the world with her voice. Her face was a mask of torment, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a terrifying, wild grief. He lowered the axe slowly, the heavy head thudding softly onto the damp earth. He was no longer a Jarl defending his honor. He was a father staring into the abyss of his child's suffering, an abyss he had just been about to deepen. The echo of the scream faded, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. For Freydis, it was as if a physical entity had been ripped from her chest. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, her entire body shaking with violent tremors. The world rushed back in with a dizzying, painful clarity. The smell of the cold soil, the rough texture of the stone wall, the terrified look on Kaelin's face. The serpent of ice and ash was gone, and in its place was a vast, raw, aching emptiness. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the force of her own long-buried trauma. She was terrifyingly, wonderfully, painfully empty for the first time in her life. In that hollow space, her father's face came into focus. She saw the rage drain away, replaced by a confusion so deep it looked like fear. For the first time, he was seeing her. Not the symbol of his failure, not the broken doll, but the 6-year-old girl, hiding in the smoke, watching her world end. He saw that the terror in her eyes was not just for Kaelin. It was of him, of the axe in his hand, of the monster he had almost become. That single, silent realization did what no army ever could. It shattered Bjorn Iron-Heart's pride. He let go of Kaelin's tunic and took a stumbling step backward, the axe forgotten at his feet. The quiet that descended upon the garden was heavier and more meaningful than any sound. It was a silence born not of absence but of consequence. Kaelin slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes never leaving Freydis. Olaf and the other warriors stood frozen at the gate, their lust for violence replaced by a primal awe and a dawning shame. They had witnessed something sacred and terrible, a soul's long-delayed reckoning. Bjorn stared at his hands, then at his daughter, then at the man she had protected. The rigid, brutal logic of his world had been broken, and he had no words to repair it. He was a king in a kingdom he no longer understood. Ignoring the warriors, ignoring the world, Freydis took a single shaky step forward, then another. She walked until she stood directly between her father and Kaelin, a fragile shield against the violence she had just halted. She did not need to speak. Her presence, her trembling defiance, was a statement more powerful than any shout. She looked at her father, and in her eyes he saw not only a plea to spare the man behind her, but a clear, heartbreaking accusation. "This is what you do," her gaze said. "This is the world you made, the world that broke me." The weight of that unspoken truth was more than the great Jarl could bear. Kaelin struggled to his feet, his body aching from the impact with the wall. He ignored his own pain, his focus entirely on Freydis. He saw the immense cost of her scream etched onto her face. She looked like a sapling after a lightning strike, still standing, but forever marked, smoke rising from a deep internal wound. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it eclipsed his own fear. He had been the catalyst, the one who had gently coaxed the first whispers from her, but he had never imagined the storm that lay behind them. He had only wanted to help her find her voice, not force her to use it as a weapon against her own blood. With a final desolate look at his daughter's face, Jarl Bjorn turned. He did not retrieve his axe. He simply walked out of the garden, his broad shoulders slumped in a way no one had ever seen before. He was a giant diminished, a storm that had blown itself out against the unyielding rock of his own child's pain. The other warriors, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion, backed away from the gate and followed their chieftain, leaving a trail of heavy, retreating footsteps. Olaf, his face pale and his cruel smirk vanished, could not meet Freydis's eyes. He had unleashed a power he could never have anticipated, and he was terrified of it. The moment they were gone, the strength that had held Freydis upright vanished. Her legs gave out, and she crumpled toward the ground. Kaelin lunged forward, catching her before she fell. He held her, his arms wrapping around her shaking frame, and then the second storm broke. A torrent of sobs, the tears of a lost child and a wounded woman, tore through her. It was a sound of pure grief, a flood of sorrow for her mother, for her lost years, for the terror that had been her only companion. Kaelin simply held on, a silent, steady anchor in the hurricane of her release, letting the poison of a decade finally wash away. He murmured to her as she wept, not in Norse, but in the soft, flowing sounds of his own language. He spoke of rain washing the dust from leaves, of a river finally reaching the sea. He offered no false comfort, only a quiet presence that promised she would not be swept away by the flood. The storm of her grief eventually quieted, leaving behind the deep, shuddering breaths of exhaustion. She leaned against him, spent and raw, the garden around them dark and still. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt in the twilight, and her lips formed a single, broken word in the harsh tongue of her father. Stay. It was a plea, a command, and a question hanging in the balance of her shattered world. The next morning, the Jarl's voice thundered through the great hall, but it was a different kind of thunder. It was weary, heavy, and devoid of its usual rage. Kaelin, the thrall from the Western Isles, was declared a free man. A collective gasp rippled through the settlement. It was an unprecedented act, a public acknowledgment of a private shame. Bjorn did not offer the proclamation as a gift of mercy, but as a debt being paid. He could not face his daughter, could not bridge the new, silent chasm that had opened between them, but he could grant this. He could remove the threat he himself had posed to the man who had succeeded, where he had so profoundly failed. Freydis's healing was not a sudden spring thaw. It was the slow, painful cracking of a glacier. The scream had broken the prison, but it had also left her exposed and vulnerable. Her voice, when it came, was a hesitant visitor. Some days it would be there, a thin, reedy whisper she practiced with Kaelin among the herbs. On other days, a sudden noise or a dark memory would send it fleeing, leaving the familiar taste of ash in her mouth. The silence was no longer her cage, but it was a part of her now, a deep and quiet river that would always run through the landscape of her soul, a reminder of the terrain she had crossed. Kaelin stayed. He was no longer a thrall, but he was not truly one of them either. He was something new, something that had no name in their rigid society. He was Freydis's Asterisk Kara, her friend. He remained the keeper of the garden, but he also became the keeper of her voice. He taught her that words were not just commands and boasts, but tools to build bridges. He used the stories of his people, tales of rebirth and resilience, to help her understand her own trauma, not as an ending, but as a part of a longer, more complex story. He gave her a new language, one of healing. In turn, she gave him a home. She taught him the language of her world, not just the words, but the silent communications. She showed him the strength in her father's unyielding code, the fierce loyalty of the warriors, the quiet beauty of a winter sunrise over the fjord. She taught him how to read the subtle shifts in the hall's atmosphere, how to understand the unspoken grief in a warrior's eyes. He had given her sound, and she gave him a deeper understanding of silence. Together, they created a space between their two worlds, a garden of shared understanding where both languages could coexist in peace. The bond between Freydis and her father was irrevocably altered. The suffocating weight of his frustration and her silent resentment was gone, but in its place was a vast, sorrowful distance. He looked at her now with a mixture of awe and fear. He had raised her to be a reflection of his strength, but she had found a different kind, one born of a vulnerability he could never afford to show. He loved her fiercely, more than ever, but it was the clumsy, humbled love of a man who knows he has broken something precious and does not know how to apologize for a wound that has no name. Years passed. The Jarl's garden, once a forgotten plot, became the heart of the settlement. Under Kaelin's patient hand, it flourished, and he with it. He was no longer seen as the foreign thrall, but as a man of quiet wisdom. People came to him not only for his herbs to soothe the fever, but for his calm presence to soothe a troubled spirit. He introduced a new kind of power into their world, the gentle, resilient strength of something that grows, a stark contrast to the brutal, shattering force of the axe. He healed the land, and in doing so he helped to heal its people. Freydis never became a woman of many words. Her voice, once unleashed, settled into a quiet, deliberate cadence. She did not shout boasts or sing loud songs in the mead hall, but when she spoke, her words carried the immense weight of her long silence. Jarls and warriors would fall quiet to listen, for she spoke with an empathy forged in trauma and a wisdom gleaned from years of pure observation. She spoke for the thralls who had no voice, for the widows of slain warriors, for the children who woke from nightmares. She became the conscience of her people, their quiet heart. She stood beside her father at the high table, no longer a ghost but a presence as formidable as his own. Where he ruled with iron, she advised with insight. She saw the cracks in men's armor, the fear behind their boasts, the needs that were never spoken aloud. She tempered his warriors' justice with a deep understanding of human frailty, making their rule not weaker, but more whole, more enduring. The Iron-Heart Jarl and his quiet daughter became a legendary pair, a perfect balance of strength and wisdom, of the storm and the earth that holds it. One cold winter evening, years later, she found Bjorn alone by the great fire, his gaze lost in the flames. He looked older, the lines on his face carved deeper by regret than by age. He looked up as she approached, a lifetime of unspoken words in his eyes. "Your mother?" he said, his voice a low rumble. She wove stories into her cloth. She believed a single thread could change the whole pattern. He reached out, his callous, scarred hand covering hers. "You are her thread, Freydis." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and it was enough. The girl who held the screen was a memory, a ghost from a story told on long winter nights. In her place stood a woman who had journeyed through a decade of silence and emerged on the other side. She had learned that a voice was not a weapon to be wielded, but a gift to be shared. She found her strength not in a battle cry that echoed the violence of her past, but in the quiet, healing words of a language she had made her own. And she finally understood that the most profound courage wasn't in holding the pain inside forever, but in finding the one person who could make it safe enough to finally let it go.